A desperate, debt-ridden father dragged a rusted, mud-caked iron chest from the soil of his failing Pennsylvania farm, praying for a miracle. Instead, he unearthed a century-old town secret. What was inside didn't just rewrite history. It put a target on his back and changed his family forever. The August sun beat down on the Mercer County Valley like a hammer on an anvil. Daniel Fisher wiped a gritty mixture of sweat and diesel exhaust from his forehead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of his dying John Deere tractor. At 34, Daniel looked 10 years older. Deep lines framed his eyes, etched there by grief and the crushing weight of impending ruin. It had been 3 years since his wife, Emily, lost her battle with leukemia. The medical bills had devoured their savings, and the subsequent bad harvests had eaten away the rest. Now, a thick manila envelope sat on his kitchen counter, delivered by certified mail 2 days ago. It was a notice of intent to foreclose from the bank. Daniel had exactly 60 days to come up with $400,000, or he and his 8-year-old son, Leo, would lose the only home their family had known for 4 generations. Desperation makes a man do foolish things. Against the advice of the neighboring farmers, Daniel was attempting to plow the dead 40, a jagged, rock-strewn acreage at the far edge of his property that hadn't been tilled since his great-grandfather's time. The soil here was notoriously unyielding, but Daniel was out of options. He needed to plant a late crop of winter wheat just to show the bank some projected revenue. The tractor roared, black smoke belching from the exhaust stack as the steel plow bit into the hard earth. Suddenly, a violent metallic shriek ripped through the air. The tractor jerked forward, the steering wheel violently twisting out of Daniel's hands, nearly snapping his wrist. The engine stalled with a pathetic sputter, leaving an eerie silence hanging over the dusty field. Daniel cursed, leaping down from the cab. He grabbed a heavy iron digging bar from the toolbox, expecting to find the plow blades wedged against a massive piece of Pennsylvania limestone. But as he dropped to his knees and swept the loose, dry dirt away with his gloved hands, his fingers brushed against something cold and unnaturally smooth. It wasn't rock. It was metal. Adrenaline, sharp and sudden, pierced through his exhaustion. He began to dig furiously, plunging the iron bar into the earth to pry away chunks of hard-packed clay. 10 minutes turned into an hour. His shirt clung to his back, but he couldn't stop. Slowly, the outline of an object began to emerge from its earthen tomb. It was a chest. Measuring roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, it was constructed of incredibly thick, dark oak, bound in heavy, rivet-studded iron straps. It was heavily corroded, covered in a century of mineral deposits and rust, but it was perfectly intact. A massive iron padlock, rusted solidly into a single lump of metal, secured a heavy latch. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. Treasure. The word sparked in his mind, a childish fantasy suddenly made terrifyingly real. Rumors had always whispered through the local taverns about old stagecoach robberies and hidden stashes left behind during the chaotic days of the late 1800s. But nobody actually believed them. He managed to wrap a heavy-duty logging chain around the chest's handles, hooking the other end to the tractor's front loader. With a groan of strained hydraulics, the tractor hoisted the heavy box from the hole. It swayed in the air, dripping clumps of dark soil. Daniel drove it straight to his barn, lowering it onto a heavy wooden workbench. He locked the barn doors, the clank of the deadbolt echoing in the dim, dusty light. He grabbed an angle grinder from his tool pegboard, plugging it in with trembling hands. Sparks rained down like a miniature firework display as the grinder's abrasive wheel bit into the ancient padlock. The smell of burning metal and ozone filled the barn. After 10 agonizing minutes, the thick iron shackle finally snapped. Daniel set the grinder down. The silence in the barn was deafening. He wedged a pry bar under the heavy lid, leaned his weight into it, and pushed. With a sickening crack of breaking seals and tearing wood, the lid heaved upward. A puff of stale, dust-laden air escaped, smelling of dried leather, decaying paper, and something distinctly metallic. Daniel coughed, waving the dust away, and leaned over the rim. There was no gold. There were no diamonds. Daniel's heart plummeted into his stomach, a wave of crushing disappointment washing over him. Inside the chest lay a series of thick, wax-sealed canvas pouches, all heavily water-stained but mostly intact. He carefully pulled the first pouch out and broke the brittle wax seal. Inside was a bundle of heavy, yellowed paper. He carefully unfolded the top sheet. The calligraphy was elegant, faded to a rusty brown ink. It was a bearer bond, dated October 14th, 1893, issued by the Pennsylvania Eastern Railroad. Face value, $10,000. Daniel flipped through the stack. There were dozens of them. Hundreds of them. But it was the object at the very bottom of the chest that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand up. It was a massive leather-bound ledger book. The leather was flaking, but the gold leaf lettering on the cover was still legible. Property and Acquisitions, Richard Gallagher. Senior, 1888 to 1904. The Gallaghers. The name was synonymous with Mercer County. They owned the massive development company that had built the luxury estates on the hills. They owned the local politicians. They effectively owned the bank that was currently trying to foreclose on Daniel's farm. Daniel slowly opened the heavy cover of the ledger. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten notes. It didn't take long for Daniel to realize he wasn't looking at a standard accounting book. He was looking at a detailed private record of bribery, extortion, and forged land deeds. His eyes locked onto a page dated April 1894. It detailed a transaction regarding a plot of land known as the River Bend Tract, a massive expanse of prime real estate that currently housed the Gallagher family's sprawling country club and multi-million-dollar subdivisions. According to the ledger, the original deed had never been legally sold. It had been stolen through a forged signature and a bribed county judge. And the name of the man who was robbed, written in stark, undeniable ink, was Elias Fisher, Daniel's great-grandfather. The magnitude of what Daniel held in his hands was paralyzing. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, a solitary desk lamp casting long shadows across the faded floral wallpaper, carefully turning the brittle pages of the Gallagher ledger. Every page was a damning indictment. It detailed how the Gallagher empire wasn't built on savvy business acumen, but on the systematic dismantling and theft of neighboring farms in the late 19th century. Elias Fisher, Daniel's great-grandfather, hadn't lost his massive acreage in a bad poker game, as the local legends claimed. He had been financially suffocated, framed for debts he didn't owe, and his land was essentially stolen through corrupt municipal courts, all orchestrated by the man whose name was on the ledger. By 6 a.m., Daniel realized two things. First, the bearer bonds in the chest were likely unredeemable or highly contested. Second, the ledger and the accompanying original, untampered land deeds were worth billions. They were the smoking gun that could unravel the entire Gallagher dynasty. "Dad, are you okay?" Daniel jumped, nearly knocking over his cold cup of coffee. Leo stood in the doorway of the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his unkempt brown hair sticking up in every direction. "I'm fine, buddy." Daniel managed a strained smile, quickly throwing a newspaper over the ledger. "Just couldn't sleep." Go get dressed, okay? I'll make pancakes. After dropping Leo off at school, Daniel knew he needed expert eyes on this. He couldn't go to the local authorities. The police chief played golf with the current Richard Gallagher III every Sunday. Instead, he drove an hour out of town to a neighboring county, pulling up in front of a dusty storefront titled Bennett's Antiquities and Appraisals. Samuel Bennett was a man in his late 60s who looked like he belonged in a museum exhibit himself. He had a shock of white hair, thick spectacles, and a reputation for unparalleled discretion. He had appraised a few antique clocks for Emily years ago, and Daniel trusted him. Daniel carried a heavy, locked duffel bag into the shop. "Samuel, I need you to look at something, and I need you to swear on your life that you won't tell a soul." Samuel looked up from a pocket watch he was repairing, sensing the raw panic in Daniel's voice. He locked the front door of the shop and flipped the sign to closed. In the back room, under the bright fluorescent appraisal lights, Daniel unpacked the ledger and a few of the deeds. Samuel put on a pair of white cotton gloves and leaned in. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of aged paper and Samuel's heavy breathing. When the old appraiser finally looked up, his face was completely drained of color. "Daniel," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you understand what this is?" "I think it proves my family owns half of Mercer County," Daniel said flatly. "It proves that the Gallagher family committed generational fraud," Samuel corrected him. "The original deeds here, complete with the unbroken wax seals of the state surveyor from 1891, contradict every record currently filed in the county courthouse. If these are authenticated, and looking at the ink oxidation and paper fiber, I have zero doubt they are. The Gallagher family's claim to their flagship properties is entirely illegitimate." Samuel took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Daniel, you have to be incredibly careful. If Richard Gallagher finds out this chest exists, he won't just take it. He will erase it, and he will erase anyone who knows about it." Daniel felt a chill trace its way down his spine. "I need a lawyer, a big one, outside the state." "I know someone in New York," Samuel said, reaching for his Rolodex. "But keep this under lock and key. Do not go home with this." Daniel left the documents locked in Samuel's massive floor safe and drove back to the farm, feeling a strange mixture of absolute terror and soaring hope. For the first time in years, a path out of the darkness was visible. But small towns have a way of breathing secrets. Perhaps it was the way Daniel had sped out of town, or perhaps the bank manager had noticed the sudden lack of panic when they called to remind him of his impending foreclosure. Whatever the trigger was, the radar of the town's most powerful man had been pinged. 2 days later, just as the sun was dipping below the tree line and painting the sky a bruised purple, a sleek, black Mercedes S-Class crawled up the dirt driveway of the Fisher farm. Daniel was on the porch, fixing a broken rocking chair. He slowly stood up, a heavy wrench still gripped tightly in his right hand. The driver's door opened, and Richard Gallagher stepped out. He was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely alien against the backdrop of the dusty farm. He had a politician's smile, wide, bright, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Daniel, good evening," Gallagher called out, casually stepping over a puddle as he approached the porch. "Beautiful property. Such a shame about the bank's recent aggression. I only just heard." "Mr. Gallagher," Daniel replied, keeping his voice deadpan. "To what do I owe the pleasure? We don't exactly run in the same circles." Gallagher chuckled, resting his hands in his pockets. "Straight to the point. I like that. Look, Daniel, I'm a man who respects local history. This land has been in your family for a long time. I know things have been difficult since Emily passed." Daniel's jaw tightened. Leave my wife out of this." "Apologies, apologies." Gallagher raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm here to help. I have a proposition. I'm willing to personally buy out your mortgage from the bank. Clear your debt entirely. In exchange, I just want a small favor." "What favor?" Daniel asked, his grip on the wrench tightening. Gallagher's smile faded, his eyes turning into cold, calculating slits. "I heard a rumor. A silly little rumor about an old iron box you dug up in the dead 40. Family folklore says my great-grandfather lost a personal ledger out here while surveying the area decades ago. It holds immense sentimental value to my family. I'll clear your $400,000 debt today in exchange for the chest and everything in it." Daniel stared at the billionaire. Gallagher didn't just suspect. He knew. Someone had talked, or Gallagher had spies watching the property. "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel lied smoothly. "I dug up some old tractor parts, rusted solid, sold them for scrap." Gallagher held Daniel's gaze for a long, suffocating moment. The crickets in the surrounding fields seemed to suddenly stop chirping. "Daniel," Gallagher said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into something dangerously soft. "People in deep debt often make poor decisions. They get greedy. They think they hold a winning hand when they don't even know the rules of the game. I would hate to see you and little Leo forced out into the street. Accidents happen to desperate people." It was a blatant, unmasked threat. "Get off my property," Daniel said, his voice rumbling with suppressed rage. Gallagher smiled again, perfectly polite. "Think about my offer, Daniel. I don't like to ask twice." He turned, got back into his Mercedes, and drove away, the red taillights fading into the encroaching darkness. That night, Daniel put Leo to bed early. He pulled his 12-gauge shotgun from the closet, loaded it with buckshot, and sat in the dark living room, staring out the window. At 2 a.m., the motion sensor lights on the barn flickered on. Daniel stood up, his heart hammering in his chest, racking a shell into the chamber. The heavy clack-clack echoed in the silent house. He looked out the window and saw the shadows of 3 men moving swiftly and silently toward the barn. The war for the Fisher farm had just begun. The heavy oak front door of the farmhouse offered little comfort against the creeping shadows. Daniel gripped his 12-gauge, the cold steel grounding him. Outside, the 3 silhouettes moved with practiced efficiency. They weren't clumsy local thugs. Their movements were tactical, silent, and deliberate. They reached the heavy sliding doors of the barn. One of the men produced a pair of massive bolt cutters, snapping the heavy steel padlock with a muted crack that carried on the wind. Daniel knew they were looking for the chest. When they found it empty, they would come for the house. They would come for him. And worse, they would come for Leo. He couldn't wait. Slipping out the back kitchen door, Daniel used the dense cover of the overgrown rhododendron bushes to mask his approach. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but a cold, primal instinct had taken over. He was a father, protecting his only child. He crept around the side of the barn, just as the heavy wooden doors groaned open on their iron tracks. Flashlight beams sliced through the dusty interior, sweeping over the rusty tractor, the hanging tools, and finally resting on the workbench where the empty iron chest sat open and exposed. "It's empty," a gruff voice echoed from inside. "Tear the place apart. If it's not here, we burn it and hit the house." A spike of pure adrenaline shot through Daniel's veins. He stepped out from the darkness, leveling the shotgun. "Don't move a muscle," Daniel roared, his voice tearing through the silent night. The 3 men froze, their flashlights whipping toward him, blinding him for a split second. But Daniel didn't flinch. He aimed high and squeezed the trigger. The deafening boom of the shotgun shattered the quiet valley, a burst of buckshot ripping through the corrugated tin roof of the barn, showering the men in rust and debris. The trespassers scrambled. They hadn't expected armed, aggressive resistance. They bolted toward the back of the barn, crashing through a side access door and disappearing into the dense cornfield that bordered the property. Daniel didn't chase them. He ran inside, his eyes stinging from the sulphurous smoke of the discharged shell. That was when he saw it. Before they fled, one of the men had tossed a flare into a pile of dry hay near the tractor. Flames were already licking up the wooden walls, greedy and fast. Daniel dropped the shotgun and grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, pulling the pin and dousing the flames in a thick cloud of white chemical powder. He coughed violently, beating out the remaining embers with his heavy work boots until the barn was dark and quiet once more. He had won the battle, but the war had escalated terrifyingly fast. The farm was no longer safe. Daniel sprinted back to the house. He burst into Leo's room, shaking the sleeping boy awake. "Leo, buddy, wake up," Daniel urged, his voice tight but controlled. "We have to go, right now." "Dad, what's going on?" Leo rubbed his eyes, confused and frightened by the urgency. "We're going on a road trip. Get your shoes on." Within 10 minutes, they were in Daniel's battered Ford pickup truck, speeding down the dark, winding county roads. He didn't pack bags. He didn't lock the front door. Nothing in that house mattered more than the boy sitting in the passenger seat. Daniel's first stop was Samuel's antique shop. He prayed he wasn't too late. If Gallagher had sent men to the farm, there was a terrible chance he had figured out who Daniel might have consulted. When he pulled up to the darkened storefront, his stomach plummeted. The glass front door was shattered, jagged shards glittering on the sidewalk under the amber glow of the street lamp. "Stay in the truck, Leo. Lock the doors and get down on the floorboard," Daniel instructed, grabbing a heavy maglite from the glove compartment. He stepped carefully through the broken glass. The shop was a disaster zone. Antique clocks lay smashed on the floor. Display cases were overturned. "Samuel," Daniel called out, his voice a harsh whisper. A weak groan came from the back room. Daniel rushed in, sweeping his flashlight across the floor. Samuel was slumped against his massive cast-iron floor safe. His face was badly bruised, and a trickle of dried blood ran down his chin. But he was breathing. "Samuel, God, what did they do to you?" Daniel knelt, helping the older man sit up. "3 men," Samuel wheezed, clutching his ribs. "Looking for the ledger. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about." "You should have given it to them, Samuel. Your life isn't worth this." The old appraiser offered a bloody, defiant grin. "They couldn't get it anyway. The safe is on a biometric time lock. It only opens for my thumbprint, and only after a 30-minute delay. They got impatient when they heard police sirens approaching. We need to get it out, now. I'm taking it to New York tonight," Daniel said. Samuel nodded weakly, pressing his thumb to the scanner. The digital display began its countdown. For 30 agonizing minutes, Daniel paced the destroyed shop, peering through the blinds, expecting Gallagher's black Mercedes to roll up at any second. When the heavy steel bolts finally clicked open, Daniel carefully packed the ledger and the original deeds into his waterproof duffel bag. "Come with us, Samuel," Daniel pleaded. "They'll come back." "I have a brother in Ohio. I'll be on the road before the sun comes up," Samuel replied, waving him off. "Go, Daniel. Burn their empire to the ground." The drive to Manhattan was a blur of black asphalt, excessive coffee, and constant paranoid glances in the rearview mirror. By the time the New York skyline pierced the morning fog, Daniel was running on pure adrenaline. Evelyn Foster's law firm occupied the 42nd floor of a sleek glass skyscraper in Midtown. She was a high-powered attorney, known for taking on massive corporate corruption cases, a shark in a tailored suit. Samuel had called her on the drive up, giving her a brief overview. When Daniel finally unzipped the duffel bag on her massive mahogany conference table, Evelyn fell silent. She spent 2 hours examining the ledger and the 1891 surveyor seals with a magnifying glass, cross-referencing names and dates on her computer. Finally, she leaned back in her leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "Mr. Fisher," Evelyn said, her eyes locked onto his. "I have sued pharmaceutical companies. I have sued Wall Street banks. But I have never seen a documented trail of fraud this blatant, preserved this perfectly." "Can it save my farm?" Daniel asked, his voice rough from exhaustion. Evelyn offered a sharp, predatory smile. "Save your farm? Mr. Fisher, if this goes the way I think it will, you could buy the bank that is trying to foreclose on you." But Evelyn knew that serving a civil suit would just give Gallagher time to bury the evidence, bribe judges, or arrange for Daniel to have a fatal accident. They needed to hit him where he couldn't fight back. They needed the federal government. 2 days later, Daniel sat in a secure room at the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan. Evelyn had brought in federal prosecutors. Because the Gallagher family had used the stolen land to secure federal grants and interstate loans over the decades, the original theft had snowballed into massive wire fraud, tax evasion, and federal racketeering. The ledger was the ultimate skeleton key. It provided dates, exact monetary bribes paid to specific municipal officials, and detailed the illegal transfer of the Fisher estate. "We've been trying to build a RICO case against Richard Gallagher for 5 years, a senior FBI agent told Daniel, looking at the ledger as if it were the Holy Grail. He was always too insulated. He always had a fall guy. But this is his grandfather's handwriting implicating the entire foundation of the family trust, the fruit of the poisonous tree. The takedown was swift, brutal, and highly public. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning. Richard Gallagher was hosting a charity golf tournament at his exclusive Mercer County Country Club, built directly on top of the dead 40, where Elias Fisher's original homestead once stood. Gallagher was mid-swing on the 9th hole when a convoy of black SUVs tore across the pristine green grass. Dozens of armed federal agents swarmed the billionaire, placing him in handcuffs in front of the local politicians and business leaders he had spent a lifetime manipulating. Simultaneously, the FBI raided the Gallagher corporate headquarters, seizing servers, freezing assets, and arresting 4 top executives who were complicit in maintaining the century-old cover-up. The news broke nationally within hours. The mighty Gallagher dynasty was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Daniel watched the arrest on a small television in his New York hotel room, his arm wrapped tightly around Leo. A profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over him. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 3 years finally evaporated. The legal aftermath took months to untangle, but with Gallagher's assets frozen and the federal government backing the validity of the 1891 deeds, the local bank immediately dropped the foreclosure on Daniel's farm. They were terrified of being implicated in the RICO charges, but the final twist came a week before Christmas. Evelyn Foster called Daniel into her office. "The land dispute is wrapping up," she explained. "The state is going to compel the Gallagher estate to pay you fair market restitution for the illegally occupied acreage. It will be in the neighborhood of $80 million. Daniel had to sit down. He couldn't process the number. "But that's not why I called you in," Evelyn continued, a rare smirk on her face. "Those old bearer bonds you found in the chest, the ones from the Pennsylvania Eastern Railroad. I assumed they were worthless," Daniel said. "The railroad went under in the 1920s. "They did," Evelyn agreed. "However, their debt was acquired by a massive holding company that still exists today. The bonds had a strange, obscure compound interest clause written into them. Legally, they have to honor the debt. We finished negotiating the payout this morning. Evelyn slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a certified check. The initial face value of the bonds was a few $100,000. But after 130 years of compounding interest, the check made out to Daniel Fisher was for an additional $22 million. Daniel drove back to Mercer County, not as a desperate, indebted farmer, but as the quietest multimillionaire in Pennsylvania. He didn't tear down his farmhouse. He didn't build a mansion. He paid Samuel handsomely for his bravery, setting the old man up for a luxurious retirement. Then, Daniel restored the farm to its former glory, buying top-of-the-line equipment and hiring local hands who had been laid off by the Gallagher collapse. On a warm summer evening, exactly a year after he had struck the buried iron chest, Daniel sat on his porch. The broken rocking chair was fixed. The fields were green and thriving. He watched as Leo ran across the lawn, chasing a firefly in the fading light. His great-grandfather, Elias, had lost everything to greed and corruption. But the earth remembers. It holds its secrets tightly, waiting for the right moment and the right hands to bring the truth back into the light. If you were captivated by Daniel's fight for justice against all odds, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Your support helps us bring more incredible, true-to-life stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling weekly uploads. Have you ever discovered a hidden piece of family history? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.